Hello and welcome to this delightful, clean, historical Western romance by Shelfie Audiobook. We're thrilled to have you join us. Before we dive in, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. Your support in these small ways helps us bring you more heartwarming romance stories at no cost. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself be swept away into a world of adventure, love, and unforgettable characters. Enjoy! This audiobook is copyrighted by Shelfie Bennett. Chapter 1. Dawn on the Frontier. The first light of dawn stretched across the rolling plains, casting a golden glow over the land that had become Jack Callahan's sanctuary. He stood at the edge of the pasture, his rough hands guiding the cattle into their morning routine, the rhythmic sounds of hooves stirring the early silence. The fresh, cool air carried the scent of hay and earth. Familiar. Grounding. A far cry from the smell of gunpowder and smoke that had once defined his world. "Come on now, you stubborn fools," Jack muttered under his breath, his voice rough from years of hard use, yet tender with a quiet patience only earned after years of struggle. His boots crunched against the dry grass as he herded the cattle into a neat line. His shirt, long-sleeved and faded from the sun, clung to his back as the heat of the day began to creep over him. He wiped a hand across his forehead, feeling the grit of the dirt that seemed to settle everywhere in the frontier. He had learned to live with it, even to appreciate the simplicity of it all. There had been a time when he would have preferred the chaos, the wild unpredictability of a lawless life. But now, here in this quiet corner of the world, he found something he hadn't even known he was searching for: peace. "Jack, you getting the herd in?" Jack glanced over his shoulder, seeing Eli striding toward him, his usual grin spread across his face. Eli was the sort of man who had never met a problem he couldn't laugh his way out of. He was solid, dependable, a friend who had stuck by Jack through thick and thin. "Almost, Eli," Jack called back, his voice gruff, but there was a warmth in it too. "You know these cows never like to move unless they're good and ready." Eli laughed as he reached Jack's side, tipping his hat back to wipe the sweat from his brow. "Might have better luck if you spoke to him like you do with the women folk. Could charm 'em into moving along." Jack gave a wry smile, shaking his head. "I'm not sure my cattle are interested in sweet talk." Eli chuckled and slapped Jack on the shoulder, a familiar gesture that spoke of years of friendship. "Maybe not. But I reckon you're right about one thing. They sure aren't in any hurry." As they worked, Jack's thoughts drifted. He could still hear the clatter of the old town's main street in his mind, the creak of wagon wheels, the shuffle of boots on dusty boards, and the ever-present chatter of folks whose lives had been intertwined with his own in ways he couldn't forget. He used to thrive in the noise. It had felt like power, the rush of adrenaline that came with living on the edge. Now, though, the silence of the ranch felt like freedom. There was something satisfying about the regular rhythm of ranch life, the way the earth seemed to hold a steady, unyielding rhythm that Jack could sync his heartbeat to. It was simple, and he liked it that way. "Don't reckon there's much excitement here," Eli said with a teasing grin. "But if it weren't for you being so stubborn, I might say you've found a little slice of heaven. You seem to like it here." Jack let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of those words. He had come here to escape, to bury the past, to be more than the man he used to be. The land had welcomed him, and he had learned to trust it. He had learned to trust the men who worked beside him. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to trust himself again. Before he could respond, a soft voice called out from the edge of the field. "Jack?" It was Clara. Her figure was outlined against the brightening sky, her silhouette elegant, a quiet presence that seemed to soften the roughness of the land itself. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he forgot the cattle, forgot everything but the woman standing there, waiting for him. She was wearing a simple, faded dress, her sleeves rolled up at the elbows, a straw hat perched atop her head, but there was something about her that caught his breath. Maybe it was the way the sunlight caught her hair, making it look like strands of spun gold. Maybe it was the way she stood, as if she belonged in this world of dirt and sweat. "I'll take care of the herd now, Jack. You've worked long enough," she said with a smile that reached her eyes, soft and warm like the early morning light. Jack gave a short nod, his heart thumping harder than it should. He wasn't used to feeling this way, not even for a moment. He had spent so many years shutting off parts of himself, locking away the soft things that had once made him vulnerable. And yet here she was, offering him kindness without asking anything in return. "I reckon you could take a hand with breakfast if you're so inclined," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, and there it was, the playful spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Clara's eyes sparkled with a teasing glint. "Breakfast, huh? I'll think about it. You've got your hands full with these cattle, after all." She sauntered closer, her boots making a soft, deliberate sound as she approached. Jack watched her, his eyes following the sway of her steps, each one more intoxicating than the last. She had an easy way about her, as if the land, the sky, and the ranch were her own personal kingdom. "Well, then," Jack said with a grin, feeling a bit of the old mischief stir inside him, "if you're going to turn down breakfast, maybe you can lend a hand elsewhere. These cattle aren't going to drive themselves." Clara arched an eyebrow. "You think I'm afraid of a few cows?" "No, but I do think you'll find them more stubborn than I am," he said with a playful wink, his heart lifting in a way he hadn't known it could. Clara chuckled, a soft sound that made Jack's chest tighten with something he couldn't name. "We'll see about that, Callahan. You're on." And with that, they fell into step together, working in a comfortable silence, their easy banter filling the spaces between their movements. Jack had always believed that the world was either black or white. There was no room for gray. But with Clara, everything felt different. Like maybe there was more to life than just survival. Maybe there was a place for him here after all. As they moved among the herd, Jack found his mind wandering, not just to the land or the work, but to the woman beside him, to the promise of something more than just the quiet existence he had built. He was no fool. He knew what was happening, and he was starting to like it. "Well, I'll be," Eli said, breaking the moment with a good-natured laugh. "If it isn't the two of you, working side by side, might be time to turn in our badges and let the two of you take over the ranch." Jack's eyes flicked to Clara, and for a brief moment their gazes locked, both of them amused and oddly aware of something unspoken passing between them. Jack smiled, feeling something settle in his chest, as if a long-buried part of him had finally found its home. "We'll see about that," he said softly, his voice full of promise, and for the first time in a long while, Jack Callahan felt like maybe he had found a reason to hope. Jack Callahan stood on the porch of the ranch house, his boots heavy on the weathered wood, eyes scanning the horizon as the day's first stars began to twinkle in the cool evening sky. The ranch had settled into its quiet rhythm, the animals fed, the chores done. A soft wind lifted the hem of his worn shirt, and for the briefest of moments, he let himself forget the troubles that had followed him here. He tipped his hat back and stared into the distance. There were no sounds except for the low rustling of the tall grass swaying under the evening breeze and the occasional distant call of a coyote. The night was always the same, peaceful, still, as though nothing in the world could touch this corner of the land. He'd built it, this place, brick by brick, board by board, after years of running from the law, from his past, from himself. Yet tonight, as the sun dipped lower behind the hills, something in the air felt different. It wasn't the wind or the familiar quiet of the ranch. No, it was something else. A change. A stirring, like a note played too softly on a piano. Barely audible, but undeniable. "Jack?" He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Her voice, soft but steady, had a way of cutting through the stillness, making the air crackle with unspoken possibilities. He glanced over his shoulder, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips when he saw Clara standing by the water pump, wiping her hands on her apron. She was dressed in a simple brown dress, her sleeves rolled up and her hair twisted back into a loose braid, but there was something about the way the last rays of daylight caught her face. Something that made his heart give an unexpected jolt. "You done with your chores, Clara?" he asked, his voice gruff, though it held a trace of warmth he didn't try to hide. She rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. "I don't know, you tell me. Last I checked, I ain't the one who's spent the whole day staring off into space." Jack let out a short laugh, stepping down from the porch and walking over to her. He could see the playful gleam in her eyes, that sharp wit she always used to cover the tenderness lurking beneath her sharp edges. "I ain't staring off into space," he said, glancing up at the gathering dusk. "I was thinking about how lucky I am to have such a hard-working partner like you." She raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying it. "Partner. I reckon that's a word that'll get you out of trouble for a bit, but I ain't so sure you're fooling me." Jack smiled, his gaze softening as he stepped closer, the scent of the land mixing with the fragrance of her perfume. Subtle, but there, just beneath the earthy scent of the evening air. He had never been one for sentiment, not after the life he had lived, but there was something about Clara that made him feel things he hadn't in years. "Maybe not," he said, his voice lower now, his tone teasing but warm. "But it's true enough. This ranch ain't nothing without you to help me run it. And it sure as hell wouldn't be as easy to get through the days without your smilin' face at the end of 'em." She tilted her head, a sly smile creeping onto her lips. "You sure know how to sweet-talk a woman, Callahan. Don't know if that'll make me think any better of you, though." "Well, I sure hope it makes you think better of me," he said, his eyes glinting with a hint of challenge. "Otherwise, you might be leaving me out here to fend for myself, and I'm not sure I could handle that." Clara stepped closer to him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was studying him, as if she could see something buried just under the surface that no one else could. "You could always use a little extra help," she said softly, her voice a little quieter now, the teasing edge fading just enough for Jack to catch it. She was standing so close now, close enough that Jack could feel the heat from her body against his, a warmth that wasn't just from the setting sun. "But I reckon you've gotten used to doing things all on your own, haven't you?" His breath hitched for a moment and he nodded slowly. "That's what I'm good at, Clara. Doing it on my own." The air between them seemed to thicken, and for a heartbeat there was nothing but the sound of their breaths. His chest tightened, and he couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to this, more than the silent companionship of two people who had come to depend on each other without ever saying it aloud. "Jack?" Her voice broke the moment, and he pulled back, clearing his throat. Clara's gaze softened as she took a step back, her eyes searching his face for something he couldn't name. "Have you heard?" she asked, her tone shifting, the playful spark fading from her eyes. "Folks are talking about someone coming to town, some new arrival." He frowned slightly, trying to shake the feeling of unease that crept in. "New arrival?" he echoed. "What do you mean?" "Some outsider, I reckon. Word's spreadin' fast, though not many know much about him. But I heard from Mrs. Beasley that he'll be here tomorrow or the day after, riding in with the stagecoach." Jack didn't say anything at first. He simply stared out over the ranch, his mind already working, trying to piece together what it could mean. Another stranger in a town that had barely seen anyone new in years? He wouldn't like the idea of it. Too much disruption, too much potential for trouble. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about," Clara continued, sensing his change in demeanor. "But folks are talking, Jack. They're curious." Jack turned back toward her, his thoughts still swirling. "Curiosity's dangerous out here, Clara. The last thing this place needs is another set of wandering eyes stirring up trouble." Her lips curved into a knowing smile, the kind of smile that Jack could never quite figure out, tender and knowing, yet somehow full of mischief. "Well," she said with a playful twinkle in her eye, "maybe he's the answer to all your lonely nights on this ranch." Jack's heart skipped, and for a moment the easy banter between them fell away. He didn't respond, not at first, because he wasn't sure what to say. The thought of anyone, let alone a newcomer, disrupting the balance they'd carved out here made his chest tighten in ways he hadn't expected. Clara noticed his hesitation, and without a word, reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was light but firm, offering a comfort that Jack didn't know he needed. "I'm sure he's just another traveler passing through," she said, her voice soft now. "But if he does come here, maybe we'll just have to see if he's got anything to offer, huh?" Jack gave her a small smile, his heart a little lighter than it had been before. "Maybe we will, Clara. Maybe we will." As the last of the light dipped below the horizon, Jack found himself wondering if maybe the arrival of this stranger would be the beginning of something new, not just for the ranch, but for him too. something that, for once, wasn't so easily ignored. And with that thought, he let the evening's quiet settle around them both, feeling a sense of anticipation that hadn't been there before. Chapter 2: The Arrival of Clara. The stagecoach rolled into town with a deafening clatter, its wheels creaking under the weight of a day's journey. A thick cloud of dust billowed behind it, settling slowly over the town's main street like a veil, dusting the wooden planks of the sidewalks and the tops of the saloon doors. A handful of horses pulled the stage to a stop in front of the livery, their breath coming in soft puffs as the driver flicked the reins, his worn leather coat creaking with the movement. Jack Callahan stood on the porch of the general store, idly sharpening his knife, his hand steady, but his gaze fixed on the stagecoach. He didn't know why. There wasn't anything particularly special about the vehicle or the commotion that followed it. Stagecoaches came and went every few weeks, each bringing in new faces, new business, and sometimes a bit of trouble. But today was different. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he sensed the shift before he saw it. The door to the stagecoach swung open with a thud, and a pair of dainty boots hit the ground first, followed by a woman whose silhouette cut through the haze of dust like a beam of sunlight through storm clouds. She straightened, unhurried, as though every movement had been choreographed for maximum grace. Her dress was simple, yet it clung to her figure in all the right places, the soft fabric catching the wind as she adjusted the brim of her hat, a wide, stylish thing that had likely seen the inside of more than one elegant parlor in a faraway city. Clara Hart. Jack had never met her, but her name had passed through the mouths of a few of the townsfolk the last few days, wrapped in whispers that hinted at mystery, and perhaps a touch of scandal. He'd always paid little mind to gossip, but something about her caught his attention in a way he hadn't expected. He didn't want to stare, didn't want to let her know she'd caught his eye, but his gaze followed her effortlessly as she moved, her posture regal yet unassuming. She was a woman who knew the weight of her presence and at the same time carried the air of someone who didn't intend to make a fuss about it. Clara lifted her chin slightly, dusting off the folds of her skirt with a practiced ease as she glanced around the town. Jack felt the pull of her gaze, though she hadn't yet looked in his direction. He couldn't explain it, but a subtle shift in the air came with her arrival, like the sound of wind rustling through dry leaves, a prelude to something yet untold. "Well, now, ain't this something?" Jack muttered to himself, shifting the knife in his hand. His voice was low, though a smile tugged at the corner of his lips despite himself. He wasn't used to this sort of feeling, no, not at all, but there was something in her that made him pause. She was too polished for a small town like this. Too elegant. He couldn't help the way his curiosity stirred. The townsfolk were beginning to gather, a few men stepping out of the saloon and leaning against the porch, watching with open interest. Even the horses seemed to stand still for a moment longer, as if drawn to the newcomer's presence. Clara took a breath, lifting her gaze to the livery as the driver hopped down to fetch her luggage. Jack could see her more clearly now, the soft lines of her face, the glimmer of intelligence in her eyes, and the delicate, composed way she held herself, as though she belonged to a world that didn't quite fit into the rough-and-tumble frontier life. She wasn't from here. No, not at all. He swallowed and made his way toward the hitching post, his boots steady on the wooden boards. A quick glance to the side showed Eli standing at the saloon's entrance, eyeing the newcomer with a raised brow. "Now, that's a sight," Eli said, a grin tugging at his lips as he leaned against the frame. "Who do you reckon she is? Ain't no one looks like that in these parts." Jack shrugged, keeping his hands in his pockets, though his mind raced. Could be anyone, he said, though the words felt wrong as soon as they left his mouth. It was clear to him that she was someone different, someone he couldn't take his eyes off of. But Jack wasn't the type to let that show. A few more townsfolk meandered over, curious whispers circulating about the newcomer's background, her reasons for coming, and the vague details they had heard. Jack ignored the chatter, choosing instead to watch her from a distance, trying to get a sense of who she was. Clara took a step forward, her eyes meeting his as if she had felt his gaze all along. There was something electric in the moment, a brief flicker of recognition, as if she too had been wondering about the man who stood on the porch, watching her. Her lips parted slightly. just enough for him to catch the gleam of a smile she didn't try to hide. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He didn't smile back, but the warmth in his chest was unmistakable. This wasn't just any woman. This was a woman who carried the weight of the world in her gaze, a woman who wasn't afraid to be noticed, and for some reason that made his pulse quicken. "You must be new here," she said, her voice smooth, lilting like the soft wind that passed through the plains. Jack stepped closer, taking his time to answer, his boots creaking on the porch. "Some might say I'm new, too," he said, his voice low, his eyes still locked with hers. "I reckon we're both still getting acquainted with this place." Clara smiled, a spark of amusement in her eyes. "I see. Well, then I guess I'll have to rely on someone around here to show me the ropes." He raised an eyebrow, feeling the pull of her challenge. "I reckon I could help with that, ma'am, if you're willing to trust a man like me." Her gaze softened ever so slightly, and there was a flicker of something between them, something neither of them could explain. She gave a slow nod. "I might just take you up on that offer, Mr. Callahan, if you don't mind my company." "I don't mind at all," Jack said, his voice deep with something more than the usual politeness. He could feel the weight of it, the way this woman made the ground under his feet feel a little less steady, a little more exciting. Clara took a small step toward him, her presence magnetic, drawing him in like the pull of the tide. "Well then, Mr. Callahan, I suppose we'd best get started, don't you think?" And just like that, as the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon, Jack found himself wondering if this was the beginning of something he hadn't even known he was waiting for. Clara Hart took her first step onto the ranch with the same measured grace she had carried herself with since arriving in town. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the horizon, and for a moment she seemed to blend with the warmth of the land itself, standing tall and composed as if she belonged there, yet still a stranger to it all. Jack Callahan watched her from the barn, his gaze steady and intense. He leaned against the doorframe, his hands resting on his hips as she made her way toward the workers. There was a quiet elegance to her, like a woman who had seen much of the world yet carried with her a softness that was rare around these parts. She was speaking with Eli and a few of the other ranch hands, her voice lilting as she asked about the daily chores. Every now and then a laugh would escape her, light and musical, and Jack couldn't help but notice how it seemed to fill the air, bringing a moment of warmth to the dusty old ranch. "Don't reckon I've seen a woman quite like her before," Ellie muttered, his eyes following Clara as she spoke with the men. "She's a city gal, you can tell by the way she carries herself." Jack grunted, not responding. He'd heard the rumors. Clara Hart had arrived in town a few days ago, and the gossip had already started to churn. She was said to be running from something, though no one knew exactly what. The kind of mystery that drew men in like moths to a flame, and Jack wasn't sure if that was a flame he wanted to get too close to. Still, he couldn't deny the way her presence stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long while. Curiosity, yes, but also an inexplicable draw that he couldn't quite shake. As the men continued their conversation, Clara turned and caught his eye. Jack straightened, his hand briefly touching his hat as a polite greeting. She smiled, and something about that smile, gentle yet full of quiet strength, made his pulse quicken just a little. She was not what he had expected. "Well, I'll be," she called out, her voice reaching him clearly. "I reckon I'm already in the way. I've been asking all sorts of questions and I've hardly got a good look at the land itself." Jack tipped his hat and took a few slow steps toward her, noting the way she stood, her back straight but her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. There was a softness to her posture now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there when she first arrived. "Can't rightly blame you for being curious," he said, keeping his tone casual, though a part of him wanted to be nearer to her. "A ranch like this ain't exactly the kind of place you get used to in a hurry." Clara nodded, her eyes briefly scanning the horizon, as though searching for something hidden within the vast expanse of land. "It's beautiful," she said slowly. "I haven't seen anything like it before. It's almost like the land stretches on forever." Jack watched her closely, the way she tilted her head, the way her eyes softened as if the land had offered her a secret no one else could hear. "Well, it's a hard land, too," Jack added, stepping closer, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. Don't let the beauty fool you. It's got a way of taking more than it gives if you're not careful. Clara turned to face him, her brow furrowing slightly. That sounds like the kind of warning that makes a person want to run. I reckon you've had more than your share of lessons? Jack chuckled, the sound rough and low. Maybe, but I've learned to respect it. It's the land that shapes folks out here, not the other way around. A brief silence passed between them, the words lingering as if they held something deeper that neither of them was ready to voice. Jack couldn't help but notice how Clara seemed to listen to him carefully, her eyes never leaving his face. There was something in those eyes, something that spoke of loss, of strength, of a past that had yet to be fully revealed. Well, Clara finally said, breaking the quiet, I've no doubt I've got plenty to learn. I'm glad I'll have folks like you to help me along the way. Her tone was teasing, but there was a sincerity to it that made Jack feel as if she wasn't just talking about ranch chores, but about something more, something between them. You'll be a quick study, Miss Hart, he said with a grin, watching as her lips curved up in a way that made his chest tighten. I've got no doubt about that. The moment hung in the air, charged with something unspoken, before Clara nodded as if to herself. Well, then, she said, her voice light but steady, I think I'll start with something easy, like a tour of the land. I could use a little time to clear my head. Jack raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. Need some company? Clara smiled softly, a knowing look in her eyes. I reckon you're a man who enjoys the quiet, but I'd be grateful for a bit of help if you don't mind. Without a word, Jack motioned for her to follow, and together they walked toward the far end of the ranch. The sun was starting to dip below the hills, casting long shadows across the land, and Clara listened intently as Jack spoke about the various parts of the ranch, how the cattle were herded, how the crops grew in the dry soil, and how the wind always seemed to blow in from the west. As they walked, there were moments when their hands brushed, just for an instant, but each time it happened, Jack could feel the warmth of her touch seep through his skin, leaving behind an ache he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the land that was vast and unyielding, there was something about Clara that was starting to stretch deep inside him, filling up the empty places that he'd forgotten even existed. That night, the campfire crackled, its orange flames dancing against the darkening sky. Jack sat next to Clara, his boots resting in the soft earth as the ranch hands gathered around. There was a gentle camaraderie among the men, and Clara seemed to fit into the group effortlessly, her laughter blending with theirs as stories were exchanged. Jack watched her from the corner of his eye, his heart thudding in his chest as she leaned closer to him, the warmth of the fire casting a soft glow on her features. She wasn't saying much, but every now and then she'd glance over at him, her gaze steady, her smile more intimate than it had been earlier that day. Tell us a story, Clara, Eli called out, his voice full of teasing. What's a lady like you got to tell us? Clara gave a playful roll of her eyes. I'm no storyteller, she said, her voice soft but with a hint of mischief. But I'll try. She went on to tell a tale of her childhood, one filled with adventure and a bit of mischief, nothing too serious, but enough to keep the men intrigued. As she spoke, Jack found himself leaning in a little closer, listening intently, his heart surprisingly light. There was something about her voice, about the way she shared bits of her past, letting the firelight illuminate the soft sadness in her eyes, that made him want to protect her. As the fire burned low and the ranch hands slowly drifted off to their beds, Jack and Clara lingered by the campfire, both lost in thought, the air between them filled with an unspoken understanding. Clara, Jack began, his voice low as if testing the waters. You've had quite the journey, haven't you? She didn't answer immediately, but her gaze softened and she nodded slightly, her fingers brushing against his. More than you can imagine, Jack. And in that moment, Jack knew there was more to Clara Hart than she let on, but whatever it was, whatever secrets she carried, he was ready to find out, one piece at a time. Chapter 3. Whispers of Deceit. The saloon was thick with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. The warm glow of lanterns cast long shadows across the worn wood floors, and the air was thick with the smoky scent of cigars and whiskey. In the corner, a poker game was underway, the sharp slap of cards against the table punctuating the soft murmur of gossip. Jack Callahan leaned against the bar, his hand wrapped loosely around a glass of whiskey, but his gaze was focused on the far end of the room, where Cyrus McAllister stood, talking in hushed tones with a man Jack didn't recognize. There was something about the way McAllister carried himself, something too polished for a place like this. His dark suit was immaculate, his boots freshly polished, and his hair slicked back with careful precision. His presence cut through the noise like a knife, commanding attention even without trying. "I heard McAllister's been making moves," Eli said, sliding up beside Jack at the bar, his voice low, the suspicion clear in his eyes. "Real shady ones. Folks around town are starting to talk." Jack's lips tightened into a thin line as he glanced at the man across the room. "Is that so?" Eli took a sip of his beer, never taking his eyes off McAllister. "Some say he's after land, a whole lot of it. Word is he's trying to get a hold of every plot he can, making secret deals with folks who ain't got the means to stand up for themselves." He leaned in closer, his breath heavy with the scent of hops. "They say he's using others to do his dirty work, making promises he don't mean." Jack's hand tightened around his glass, the warmth of the whiskey doing little to settle the knot forming in his stomach. He had heard rumors of land disputes before, squabbles over property lines and water rights. But the way McAllister moved through the room, with that cold, calculating air about him, made Jack uneasy. He could sense the tension beneath the surface, the barely contained greed that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. "He's dangerous," Jack muttered, his voice low. Eli nodded, his eyes narrowing as he watched McAllister turn and speak briefly with another man before making his way toward the back of the saloon. "Folks around here don't take kindly to men like him. They'll be wanting to see him run out of town before long." Jack's gaze followed McAllister's every move, but something about the way the man walked, so sure, so confident, told Jack that he was here to stay. For how long, Jack couldn't say, but it was clear McAllister wasn't just here for a drink. As the night wore on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change the course of his quiet life on the ranch. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it in his bones. The saloon, full of life and laughter, seemed to grow dimmer, as if the very walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Later that evening, Jack found himself walking beside Clara down the quiet streets of town, the cool night air a welcome change from the stifling heat of the saloon. The rattle of the wagon wheels in the distance and the soft chirping of crickets were the only sounds that filled the silence between them. Clara had insisted on walking, even though Jack could tell she was tired. "You don't mind, do you?" she asked, her voice soft as they passed the old storefronts, their windows dark and empty. "I needed some air." Jack shook his head, a half smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I don't mind one bit. Just don't go getting yourself lost in the dark. Wouldn't want you out here alone." Clara smiled at him, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Don't worry about me, Jack. I've got my wits about me." Jack glanced at her, his smile fading slightly. There was a quiet strength in Clara that he admired, but he couldn't help but feel protective of her, especially after the look of unease that had crossed her face when they'd passed McAllister in the saloon earlier. She hadn't said anything, but Jack had seen it in her eyes, an unspoken understanding, a recognition of the danger in that man's presence. "You know," Clara began, breaking the silence as they walked side by side, "I never thought I'd end up here. I was raised with certain expectations, a certain life ahead of me, but—" She trailed off, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her shawl. "Well? Things don't always go as planned, do they?" Jack slowed his pace, his curiosity piqued. "No, they sure don't." He glanced at her, his brow furrowed slightly. "What happened? You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but if you ever need someone to listen—" Clara stopped walking for a moment, her gaze distant as she stared at the dark sky, as though she was seeing something far beyond the stars above. "I don't know all the details, Jack, but there's talk that my family has connections to land, to a fortune of sorts. I don't understand it, not fully, but it's why I'm here. People are after it. after me, and She stopped herself, shaking her head. I'm trying to figure it all out. I didn't want to bring this to your doorstep, but I don't know where else to turn. Jack's protective instincts kicked in, his heart tightening as he stepped closer to her, the distance between them suddenly feeling too great. He didn't know what kind of trouble she was involved in, but he didn't like the thought of her being alone in it, not when she had already proven to him that she was more than capable of handling herself. But Jack knew there were some things even the strongest women couldn't face alone. You don't have to explain it all right now, he said, his voice soft but firm. But if you need help, I'll be here. I'll make sure nothing happens to you, Clara. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Clara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as though weighing his words. Then, with a soft sigh, she nodded. Thank you, Jack. I don't know what I'd do without you. There was a moment of silence, the world around them holding its breath, as Jack's heart beat a little faster. She wasn't just thanking him for help with a simple problem. No, there was something deeper in her voice, something that made his chest tighten with an unspoken connection. As the night deepened, the town was quieter than it had been in weeks. The air felt thick with something Jack couldn't name, like the stillness before a storm. The cattle in the distance shifted uneasily, and the occasional rumble of thunder sounded from far off in the hills. Jack watched Clara walk toward the small boarding house where she was staying, her silhouette fading into the darkness. His mind was a swirl of thoughts, most of them tied to her mysterious past, her vulnerability, and the unsettling feeling he couldn't shake. McAllister's shadow loomed large in the town, and Jack had a feeling it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. He stood there for a long moment, watching the shadows stretch across the town, feeling an unease settle deep in his bones. Whatever was coming, he couldn't protect Clara from it alone, but by God, he would try. The night held its breath, waiting. Jack Callahan could feel the weight of the silence, heavy with the knowledge that things were changing, and not all changes were for the better. Chapter 4: Betrayal in the Shadows. The first light of morning hadn't quite reached the ranch yet, but Jack Callahan was already awake. He stood by the barn, his coat pulled tightly around his shoulders against the cool bite of the morning air. The cattle were quiet in their pens, and the land lay still, almost too still, like it was holding its breath. Jack hadn't slept well. The weight of the last few days had settled on his chest like a heavy stone, and no matter how many times he'd turned his pillow over, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was just before dawn when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see one of the ranch hands, but it was someone else, someone he hadn't expected. Charlie, a young ranch hand, walked slowly toward him, his hands in his pockets, his face drawn and serious. Jack, Charlie said, his voice tight. I need to talk to you. Jack narrowed his eyes, sensing the change in the air. Charlie wasn't a man to walk around in the early morning unless something was weighing on his mind. What's going on? Jack asked, his voice steady but cautious. Charlie glanced around nervously, his gaze flicking to the barn, the fence, and then back to Jack. It's McAllister. He's been making deals with folks you trust. I didn't want to say nothing, but I reckon you need to know. Jack's stomach tightened. The name McAllister had been a shadow hanging over the ranch for days now, and each mention of it seemed to twist a knife in his gut. What do you mean? Deals? Jack's voice was low, the words coming out in a rough whisper. He could feel his pulse quicken as Charlie stepped closer, speaking in hushed tones, his eyes darting nervously. I'm not proud of this, Jack, Charlie said, swallowing hard, but I've seen things. McAllister's been paying off some of the men to help him take control of the land here. I don't know all the details, but there's money involved. He's making promises, saying there's a way to get rich quick. He's not playing fair, Jack. The words hit Jack like a slap. His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in a way that made his blood run cold. McAllister was a snake, no doubt, but Jack hadn't thought he'd been able to get to his own men, to someone Jack had trusted. Who else knows? Jack growled, his anger bubbling up to the surface. Charlie flinched at the tone in Jack's voice, but pressed on. I don't know. I just know I had to tell you. I couldn't stand seeing it happen, not with you and the others working so hard to make this ranch grow." His voice dropped, filled with shame. "I never meant to betray you, Jack, but I've been part of it too. I'm not proud of that." The confession hung in the air like smoke, and Jack felt the ground beneath him shift. The betrayal was palpable, sharp like a thorn lodged deep in his side. He had always trusted his men, trusted the ones he'd fought alongside, but now he felt like a fool. Jack took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his emotion. The anger was there, but it was tangled with a sick feeling in his gut. This wasn't just about money or land, it was about trust, something he thought he had built, something that now felt fragile, like it could crumble at any moment. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Jack's voice was quieter now, the hurt lacing his words more than the anger. "Why let it go on this long?" Charlie looked down at the ground, unable to meet Jack's gaze. "I didn't know who to trust, Jack. I was scared, I guess. But I'm not running anymore. I can't be part of this." Jack's fists clenched at his sides. The weight of the betrayal settled in his chest like a stone. But there was something else there, too. Something that burned hot and sharp. The determination to make it right, to get to the bottom of this and put an end to McAllister's game. "I'll deal with this," Jack said, his voice low and resolute. He turned toward the barn, his mind already working through what he needed to do next. "Get inside, Charlie. We'll talk more later." Charlie nodded, his face pale, and turned to walk back toward the ranch house. Jack didn't move for a moment, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon, his thoughts a whirlwind. McAllister had been after the land, yes, but this was something different. He had made a play to take control, to break the trust Jack had with the men who worked beside him. Jack wouldn't let that stand. He couldn't. By the time the sun had risen and the ranch had begun to stir, Jack was already deep in thought, his mind spinning with the weight of Charlie's words. He'd spent hours walking the land, trying to sort through the anger and the confusion, trying to come up with a plan. He couldn't let McAllister win. Not now. Not after all he'd fought for. It was then that Eli came to him, the steady presence of his best friend offering a moment of solace. Ellie had been Jack's rock, his brother in arms for years. He knew the land and its people better than anyone, and Jack needed him now more than ever. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Ellie said, his voice light but his eyes sharp with concern. Jack looked at Ellie, the tension still in his shoulders. "Worse than that. Charlie confessed something to me. He's been part of McAllister's dealing with some of the men. He's been taking money to help McAllister take over." Ellie's face darkened, his jaw tightening as Jack spoke. "So the rumors were true then. McAllister's been making moves, and now he's got our own people helping him." Jack nodded, the sting of betrayal still fresh. "I don't know who else is in on it, but Charlie said McAllister's promised him all wealth, said there's a way to get what they deserve. It's all lies, but the damage is done." Ellie's expression hardened, his voice full of steel. "Then we'll put a stop to it. We don't let no man, not even McAllister, take what's ours." Jack looked at his best friend, his chest swelling with gratitude. Eli had always been there for him, through the worst of times, and now, once again, Eli's loyalty and steadiness were a balm to Jack's frayed nerves. "You're right," Jack said, his voice low with determination. "We'll take care of it, together." The two men stood side by side, their faces set and their hearts filled with resolve. Whatever McAllister had planned, it wasn't going to be easy, but Jack knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone tear apart what he had built, not without a fight. And so they began their plan, working in the shadows of betrayal but knowing that the light of truth would always come to expose the darkness. Jack Callahan stood at the edge of the ranch, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where the sun had long since dipped below the hills. The cattle were quiet for the evening, the last light of day stretching out across the plains, giving everything a golden hue. The world felt still, like it was waiting, holding its breath for what was to come. Beside him, Eli ran a hand through his unkempt hair, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the distant hills. The man had been Jack's best friend for as long as he could remember, and tonight There was a tension between them that neither man could ignore. The shadows had been growing longer, both literally and figuratively, ever since McAllister had wormed his way into their lives. "This ain't good, Jack," Eli said, his voice gruff like it always got when something heavy weighed on him. "We've got men in town who've already made deals with McAllister, and we ain't even sure who's on our side anymore." Jack didn't answer right away. He just stared out at the land, as if hoping the vast open space would give him some sort of answer, some direction. But the only sound that met him was the steady rustling of the wind through the tall grasses and the distant call of a coyote. The land, like the men who worked it, had always been loyal to him, but now loyalty felt like something as fragile as a thread in the wind. "I know," Jack finally said, his voice rough but sure. "But we can't let McAllister think he's got the upper hand. We've been working this land for years, and I'll be damned if I let him take it from us without a fight." Eli nodded, but Jack could see the weight in his eyes. The fear of not knowing who else was involved. The worry about what McAllister would do next. Still, there was a determination there, too. It was that same stubborn, unwavering spirit that had gotten them both through worse things in the past, and now Jack knew they would need every ounce of it. They walked side by side, the sound of their boots crunching on the dry earth filling the silence. There was no need for more words. They both knew what had to be done. They would find out the full extent of McAllister's plot. They would expose every secret, every hidden hand that had been played against them.
They wouldn't stop until they had a reckoning.
As they made their way back toward the ranch house, Jack's thoughts drifted to Clara. She had been through enough already, her mysterious past, the threats she had faced. Jack couldn't let her face any more danger, not when he could do something about it. He had a deep-rooted need to protect her, a feeling that had grown stronger with each passing day. "You think Clara's going to be safe?" Eli asked, breaking into Jack's thoughts. Jack glanced over at his friend, finding the same concern in Eli's eyes that he felt in his own chest. "I hope so. I don't think McAllister's after her specifically, but she's caught up in all this mess now, and that's enough to put a target on her back. I won't let anything happen to her." Eli gave him a knowing look. "You've got it bad for her, don't you?" Jack's expression softened, a rare smile playing at the edges of his lips. "Maybe, but that ain't got nothing to do with it. I care about her. I don't want her caught in the crossfire of whatever McAllister's scheming." Eli's gaze softened too. "I know, Jack. I see it. And I know you'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe. You've always been like that." They reached the porch of the ranch house, and Jack paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. "We've got a long road ahead of us," he said, his voice steady with resolve. "But I'm not backing down. Not from him. Not from anyone." Eli placed a hand on his shoulder, the weight of his trust and friendship clear in the gesture. "We'll face it together. You ain't alone in this." The words hung in the air, a bond unspoken but strong. Eli had always been the one Jack could count on, the one who had never faltered in the face of adversity. It was that loyalty, that strength, that made Jack sure they would make it through this, no matter how dark it got. As the two men stood there, the distant howl of a coyote reached their ears, long and mournful, its echo bouncing across the land. The sound seemed to stretch out forever, a reminder that in this wild, untamed place, things were never as simple as they appeared. Jack glanced toward the hills once more, the shadows now stretching long across the ranch. He felt the weight of what was coming, the storm that had been brewing for far too long, but there was something else too. A quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would face it with everything they had. "We'll get through it, Eli," Jack said, his voice low but full of confidence. "Together." Eli nodded, his face grim but resolute. "Damn right." As the moon rose higher in the sky, casting its pale light over the quiet ranch, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. The world around him seemed to be shifting, the calm before the storm settling over them like a heavy blanket. But there was no turning back now. Jack knew one thing for certain. Whatever McAllister had planned, they would face it head on. The storm was coming, and they were ready for it. The small study in the ranch house was dim in the early morning light, the shadows still stretching long across the wooden floor. Clara sat at the desk, a pile of old letters and yellowed documents scattered in front of her, each one carrying the weight of secrets she'd never imagined. Her fingers, trembling ever so slightly, brushed over the edges of the pages as she slowly began to unfold a truth that had long been buried. The morning sun, soft and golden, filtered through the window, casting faint patterns of light on the worn desk. The quiet of the room was a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. She'd known in the deepest part of herself that there was more to her story than she'd ever been told, but as she read through the letters, the words seemed to leap off the pages, revealing fragments of a life she had never known. It was a history tied to land, to inheritance, to a family legacy that was as mysterious as it was dangerous. The letters spoke of a fortune tied to the ranch, a fortune that had been passed down through generations, one that Clara's father had kept hidden from her. The realization settled like a heavy weight in her chest, and she had to fight to keep her hands steady as she read. Great-great-grandfather Andrew Hart, she whispered to herself, reading the name aloud for the first time. The words seemed to echo in the still room, a connection to a past she barely understood. A name she had never known, now bound to the very land she had come to call home. Her mind raced as she pieced the fragments together. Her family had once owned vast tracts of land that now lay under McAllister's influence, the very land that Jack and the ranch hands had fought to protect. Clara had never known the full story, only that her father had always kept her at arm's length from any discussion of family matters. Now the secrets were spilling out before her eyes. She let out a slow breath, feeling a wave of dizziness threaten to take her. She didn't know what to do with this newfound knowledge. The land wasn't just a place to work or a piece of property to be fought over. It was a part of her that had been hidden away for far too long. Just as the weight of it all threatened to crush her, she heard the soft creak of the door opening. Jack entered quietly, his boots making little sound on the wooden floor. His presence filled the room, his strong silhouette outlined by the soft morning light. Clara looked up, startled, but his steady gaze met hers with understanding, as though he knew exactly what she had been reading. "Everything all right?" Jack asked, his voice low but warm. Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight with a mix of emotions. She wanted to tell him everything, wanted to share the discovery, but there was a part of her that held back, unsure how to explain the gravity of it all. She paused, her voice faltering. "Jack, I didn't know. I didn't know any of this." Jack stepped closer, his eyes softening as he saw the confusion and the storm of emotion swirling in Clara's expression. He rested a hand on the back of her chair, his touch gentle but grounding. "What's going on, Clara?" he asked, his voice steady, full of quiet reassurance. Clara looked down at the letters, the words a blur as her hands shook ever so slightly. "I've been going through these documents. They're about my family, about the land we thought we didn't have a claim to. Jack, it's all connected. My great-grandfather, Andrew Hart, he was the one who owned the land before it was passed down to my father." Jack's brow furrowed as he processed the words. His eyes drifted over the papers she had spread out on the desk, his mind working quickly as he pieced together the fragments. He had heard rumors about the land, about the wealth that lay hidden within its boundaries, but hearing it from Clara was a different story entirely. This was personal. This was hers. "Your father never told you about this?" Jack asked, his voice gentle but with a thread of disbelief. Clara shook her head, her fingers trembling as she folded the letters back into a neat pile. "No, he never spoke of it. He always kept me away from any talk of the family. He didn't want me to know. I thought it was just a way of protecting me, but now..." Her voice trailed off as she looked at Jack, the confusion in her eyes evident. "Now, I don't know what to think." Jack stepped around the desk and crouched beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers. She was trembling slightly, and he could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that came from unearthing truths that were better left buried. "It's a lot to take in, I know," Jack said softly, his gaze steady on her face. "But whatever it means, whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Clara nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the weight of the past wouldn't break her. But the truth was, she felt exposed. Her past was a mystery, one that was now intertwined with a future she had yet to understand. "Do you think McAllister knew?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he knew this was mine?" Jack's jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath his skin as he considered the question. "I wouldn't put it past him. He's been after this land for too long. But we'll find out, Clara. We'll make sure he knows that he can't just take what doesn't belong to him." There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something fierce and protective, and Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest at the promise. Jack wasn't just talking about the land, he was talking about her, about protecting her. The distant rumble of thunder shook the windows, a low growl in the distance, signaling the storm that was approaching. It wasn't just the weather that was changing. The storm inside her was building, too. But Jack's hand on hers was steady, grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this. She looked up at him, her heart beating faster as their gazes locked. "I don't know what to do with all of this, Jack." "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his voice low and sincere. "We'll take it one step at a time, together, and we'll see it through no matter what comes." The storm outside was getting closer, but for a moment Clara felt as if the world had quieted around them. The only thing that mattered was the steady, unspoken promise between them, a promise to face whatever came next, hand in hand. As the thunder rumbled again, closer this time, Clara allowed herself to relax just a little, leaning into Jack's presence. She wasn't sure what the future held, but with Jack by her side, she felt like maybe, just maybe, they could face anything. Chapter 5: Piecing Together Clues. The small cabin creaked under the weight of the afternoon sun, its old beams groaning with every gust of wind that passed through the trees. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air, and the wooden table at the center of the room was cluttered with papers, maps, and the worn edge of a pencil that had seen better days. Jack leaned over the table, his brow furrowed as he studied the faded ink on the map, tracing the lines that led to the land they were trying to protect. Clara sat opposite him, her fingers lightly brushing over the pages of documents she had brought with her. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face, and her gaze was intent, her mind clearly working through the puzzle before them. Jack couldn't help but notice the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the soft line of her jaw tightening as she focused. The land they both held dear was under threat, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, just as much as it weighed on him. Eli stood nearby, leaning casually against the doorframe, his arms crossed as he watched them work. His usual relaxed demeanor seemed to hold a bit more tension now, but his eyes never wavered from the task at hand. He was the steady one, the anchor between Jack's fierce protectiveness and Clara's quiet resolve. If there was anyone who could bring some balance to the situation, it was Eli. "You reckon we're looking in the right place?" Eli asked, his voice low but full of the certainty that Jack had come to rely on over the years. Jack let out a long breath and looked at the map again. "I don't know, but it feels like we are. These landlines, they're tied to something more than just a piece of land. Clara's family has a history here, and I intend to uncover every part of it." Clara looked up at him, her eyes soft but determined. "It's not just about land, Jack. It's about what McAllister's willing to do to take it. We need to understand where he's coming from, what he's planning. The land is only part of it." Jack's protective instincts flared at the thought of Clara being caught in McAllister's schemes, but he kept his expression steady. "We'll figure it out. Together. But you're right. We need to know what he's after and why he's been so hell-bent on claiming what's rightfully yours." Clara nodded, her hand running over the map as she found the lines that matched the ones from the documents they had uncovered. These boundaries, they don't just mark ownership. They mark something far more valuable, at least to someone like McAllister. "This land's been in my family for generations. But there's more to it than just land. I can feel it." Her words struck Jack like a hammer to the chest. He hadn't considered what McAllister might be truly after. The land was valuable, yes, but maybe there was something more, something Clara hadn't fully discovered herself, a legacy. A secret buried beneath the soil and the rocks, one that could change everything. Do you think McAllister knows what's really here? Jack's voice was barely above a whisper, but his eyes were sharp, piercing through the map as though he could see the answers himself. Clara's fingers trembled as she brushed over the edge of the parchment. I think he's guessing. But he knows there's something to be had. That's why he's playing dirty, Jack. He's trying to get ahead of us. Eli, who had been mostly quiet up until now, pushed himself off the doorframe and walked over to the table, studying the map with keen interest. Well, it's clear he's got a mind for trouble, that much is for sure. But if there's someone we're missing, we'll find it. We just need to piece it together, bit by bit. Jack looked at Eli and saw the steadiness in his eyes, the quiet confidence that came from years of facing down tough situations. His best friend was right. Together, they would figure it out. They always did. Clara's hand rested on the map, her voice low but strong. We need to find what's hidden in this land before McAllister does. If there's a fortune here, we can't let him take it. Jack met her gaze, his heart swelling with a mix of admiration and fierce protectiveness. You've got more courage than anyone I know. We'll stand by you, Clara. We'll get through this. Eli grinned and placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. Ain't no doubt about that. Now let's get back to this map. We're closer than we think. They fell into a quiet rhythm, each of them marking points on the map, each of them unraveling the mystery that lay between the lines. The soft scratch of the pencil against the paper, the murmur of their voices as they worked through theories filled the cabin. The tension between them melted into a shared determination, a sense of unity that bound them together more than the mystery of the land. But as the hours passed, a new sound reached them. The faint thud of hooves in the distance. Slow at first, but unmistakable. The sound of riders, drawing nearer. Jack's head snapped up, his body stiffening as though every part of him was on alert. Clara and Eli froze at the same moment, their eyes locked on Jack's face as he stood up straight, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that leaned against the wall. The sound of the hooves grew louder, closer, and Jack felt a tight knot form in his stomach. McAllister's making his move, Jack said, his voice low and filled with resolve. We need to be ready. Clara stood up, her face pale but set with the same fierce determination Jack had seen before. Then let's not waste any time. We've got work to do. As the sound of hooves approached, echoing across the quiet ranch, Jack felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. This was it. The storm was coming, and they had to be ready. The lines between right and wrong had been drawn long ago, and now they would have to walk them with eyes wide open. Together, they would face whatever McAllister had planned. Together, they would protect this land and each other. And as Jack looked at Clara, his heart swelling with both fear and hope, he knew that no matter what, they would fight for the truth. The sound of hooves grew louder as they made their way back toward the ranch house, their steps quickening in time with the growing intensity of the approaching storm. Jack, Clara, and Eli had gathered the documents and maps, their minds racing with the weight of the revelations they'd uncovered. There was no turning back now. McAllister's presence was an unmistakable threat to everything they held dear. The wind picked up again, swirling around them, the dry brush rustling underfoot. Clara kept pace with Jack, her steps steady, but her gaze was focused on the horizon. The tension in her shoulders was palpable, her brow furrowed as she looked out across the vast open land. The ranch, their sanctuary, was about to become the battlefield of something far larger than they had ever anticipated. Jack couldn't help but notice the way Clara carried herself, strong and steady even as the storm clouds gathered above them, as if she too could sense the coming danger. He had known her to be brave, but this new layer of resolve in her, this quiet strength, only deepened the admiration he had for her. She wasn't just a woman caught up in a dangerous game. She was a force unto herself, standing beside him ready to face the unknown. They reached the porch and Jack paused, his eyes scanning the darkening sky. The first gusts of wind tugged at his shirt and the ranch house groaned, its creaky bones feeling the weight of the coming storm. Clara stepped up beside him, and Eli followed close behind, his usual grin replaced with a look of grim determination. "Damn storm's coming quick," Eli remarked, his voice steady despite the clear unease in the air. "Not just the storm," Jack replied, his voice low, his eyes narrowing. He pointed toward the horizon where silhouettes had begun to form against the sky, dark shapes on horseback that were steadily growing nearer. McAllister's men. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she looked where Jack pointed. The distant riders were unmistakable, their figures stark against the purple and orange sky as the sun set behind them. She could feel it too, the threat that loomed over them like an unseen hand, pushing them closer to the edge of a confrontation neither of them had wanted. The land they'd fought for, the land she'd recently learned was hers by right, was under siege, and there was no avoiding the coming battle. "We need to prepare," Jack said, his tone sharper now. His hand rested on the rifle at his side, and for a moment he glanced at Clara, his expression hardening. "Stay inside, Clara. This is no place for—" "No." Her voice was firm, interrupting him before he could finish. She stepped forward, her eyes set with determination. "I'm not going to sit inside while this happens." "I've got a stake in this too." Jack's jaw tightened. He had half expected her to say that, but it didn't make it any easier. The storm wasn't just the weather anymore. It was the culmination of everything McAllister had been working toward, everything they had tried to stop. Clara's presence here, standing beside him, was both a comfort and a worry. He wanted her safe, but he couldn't deny that she was part of this fight. Clara looked up at him, her eyes unwavering. "You need me, Jack? You know it." Eli glanced between the two of them and gave a small chuckle, though it was laced with tension. "I reckon I'm not the only one who's stubborn round here. If Clara says she's stayin', then it's stayin'." Jack met Clara's gaze, and for a moment the wind seemed to stop, the world holding its breath as they locked eyes. He could see it in her, the same determination, the same fire he'd seen from the moment she'd arrived on the ranch. There was no turning back, not for her, not for any of them. With a slow exhale, Jack nodded. "Fine, but stay behind me, Clara, I mean it." "I'll be right behind you," she said with a small smile, but there was steel in her voice. Her hands clenched at her sides, ready to face whatever came next. Jack's heart swelled with admiration, but the protective urge still burned fiercely within him. Eli slapped Jack on the back, his grin returning, though it was edged with a quiet seriousness. "Well, if we're all in this together, then let's not waste any more time. We've got a fight ahead of us, and McAllister won't wait for us to get our ducks in a row." Jack's lips tightened into a thin line, and he turned toward the barn. "We'll make sure he doesn't get what he's after, this land, this ranch. It's ours, and I'll be damned if I let him take it without a fight." The wind howled again, a reminder of the storm's arrival, and the sound of hooves continued to grow louder as the riders drew closer. Jack's hand rested on his rifle as he made his way to the barn, his mind already racing with plans and contingencies. The ranch house, the land, it was more than just soil and timber. It was their home, their future, Clara's future. With every step, Jack felt the weight of the coming fight pressing down on him, but the resolve within him only grew stronger. He wasn't just fighting for the land. He was fighting for Clara, for their future together. And no matter what McAllister thought he could take, Jack wasn't going to let that happen. They were ready. The sound of approaching hooves reached them, and the unmistakable thud of footsteps marked the arrival of McAllister's men. The storm clouds loomed ominously above them, their dark silhouettes cutting against the waning light. The quiet before the storm was finally broken. Jack looked over his shoulder at Clara one last time, the fire in her eyes matching his own. There was no more time for hesitation. The moment had come. As they stepped outside, the first raindrops began to fall, mingling with the wind and the sound of hooves pounding closer. The clash was inevitable, and as the storm raged around them, Jack knew that the battle for the land and for their future had only just begun. Chapter 6: The Showdown at Sundown. The desert air was heavy, thick with the promise of an impending storm, both in the sky and on the ground. The sun, a fiery orb hanging low in the sky, painted the canyon walls in hues of orange and crimson, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the earth. Jack Callahan stood with Clara and Eli atop a rocky outcrop, their eyes fixed on the vast expanse before them. The canyon, which had once seemed like a peaceful retreat, now felt like the stage of an unwelcome drama, where every stone, every gust of wind, whispered of what was to come. Jack's fingers tightened around the reins of his horse, his mind sharp and focused, every muscle taut with anticipation. His boots scraped against the rocky ground as he shifted his weight, trying to make himself comfortable despite the tension that gripped him. Clara stood beside him, her back straight and her gaze unblinking as she stared into the distance. She was the calm in the storm, her presence grounding Jack as the world seemed to whirl around them. "Ready?" Eli's voice broke through the silence, low but firm, like the rumble of thunder in the distance. Jack turned his head slightly, catching the look in Eli's eyes. It was the same look he always saw before the fight, steadfast, determined, but tinged with a hint of concern. Eli had always been the reliable one, the steady hand that helped guide them through the toughest times. Today, though, the stakes felt different, higher. The weight of the situation hung in the air, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to change, for better or worse. "We'll have to be quick," Jack replied, his voice steady, though it barely masked the storm brewing inside him. He nodded toward Clara, who stood with her hand resting on the hilt of a pistol. "We'll need to use the terrain to our advantage. We know McAllister's men are close, but they won't know exactly where we are until they're already on top of us." Clara gave him a sharp nod, her eyes glinting with something fierce. Something that sent a surge of pride through Jack's chest. She was more than just a woman caught up in the chaos. She was a force, a partner in every sense of the word. He had always known she was strong, but as he looked at her now, the way her jaw was set, the way her gaze never wavered, he realized just how much she had become a part of this fight. They were in this together. Eli, ever the pragmatic one, squatted down beside the rocks, scanning the landscape for signs of movement. "They'll come through that pass," he said, pointing toward a narrow gap in the canyon walls that led into the valley beyond. "That's where they'll be vulnerable. We'll need to hold them off till they come close enough." Jack met Eli's gaze, their unspoken understanding passing between them like a shared bond, a promise of solidarity. There was no backing down now. McAllister had crossed a line, and now it was time for them to draw their own. Clara joined them, her movements graceful but purposeful as she moved to stand beside Jack. She adjusted the brim of her hat, squinting against the setting sun. "I'll take the high ground," she said, her voice steady. "I can cover the pass from above." Jack shot her a glance, a warning in his eyes. "It's too dangerous up there, you'll be exposed." "I'm not afraid of a little danger," Clara said, a small but confident smile curling the corners of her lips. "Besides, I can see farther from up there. It's the best position." Jack opened his mouth to protest, but Eli cut him off with a single glance. "Let her do it, Jack. She's right." Jack hesitated for a moment, his protective instincts battling with the knowledge that Clara was right. If anyone could handle it, it was her. With a resigned sigh, he nodded. "All right, but stay low. And if anything goes wrong, get back here fast." Clara gave a quick nod before turning on her heel and heading toward the narrow ledge that would take her up into the canyon's high ground. Jack watched her go, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and concern. He knew Clara was capable, but that didn't make him any less worried. Not today. The sky was darkening now, the orange and purple of the sunset giving way to the deep indigo of twilight. The wind had picked up, whipping around them in a swirling gust that tugged at their clothes and sent the scent of sagebrush and earth into the air. The land, once familiar and peaceful, now felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Jack turned to Eli, his expression hardening. "We'll need to be quick, Eli. Once they're in the pass, we don't have much time." Eli grinned, his usual carefree smile edged with determination. "Ain't no hurry. We'll make 'em pay for every step they take." Jack's lips curled into a tight smile as they exchanged a knowing look. This was it. The calm before the storm. The final moment of quiet before everything they'd been fighting for came crashing down. As the minutes ticked by, the hooves in the distance grew louder, the rhythmic pounding a drumbeat to the impending conflict. The men on horseback, McAllister's men, were closing in. Jack's hand tightened around the rifle at his side as he shifted into position, making sure to keep low against the rocks. Every nerve in his body was on edge. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, the lives of everyone on the ranch hanging in the balance. The distant thud of hooves was now unmistakable, each beat drawing nearer. Jack's breath quickened, but he kept his focus sharp, his eyes scanning the pass for any sign of movement. And then, just as the first figure appeared in the distance, a silhouette against the fading light, Jack knew the storm was coming. Not just in the sky above, but on the ground, too. McAllister had come to play his hand, and now it was time for Jack, Clara, and Eli to make sure that hand didn't win. The wind howled again, the dry brush whispering its warning, and Jack's heart pounded as the first of McAllister's men entered the pass. This was the moment, and there was no turning back. The canyon walls echoed with the sharp clash of metal as Jack Callahan parried McAllister's strike, the sound of steel meeting steel ringing through the air. Sweat trickled down his brow and his breath came heavy, his muscles aching from the relentless exchange. McAllister's dark eyes gleamed with greed, the fire of ambition burning in them as he pressed forward, swinging his blade with calculated precision. The air between them crackled with tension, each swing a reminder of the stakes. Redemption versus greed, honor versus betrayal. "You think you can stop me, Callahan?" McAllister taunted, his voice dripping with venom. "You're just a fool in the dust, trying to hold on to something that isn't yours." Jack gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the hilt of his own sword. The heat of the day seemed to bear down on him, but it wasn't the sun that made him sweat. It was the weight of what was at stake. He wasn't just fighting for the ranch, he was fighting for everything he had built. For the trust of the men who had worked alongside him, for Clara, whose faith in him had never wavered. "You're wrong, McAllister," Jack said through clenched teeth, blocking another strike. "This land doesn't belong to you, and neither does the future you're trying to steal." A growl of frustration escaped McAllister, and he swung again, the blade slicing through the air with a deadly arc. Jack sidestepped, his boots kicking up the loose gravel beneath him as he countered with a quick thrust, narrowly missing McAllister's side. The wind had picked up, swirling around them like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of earth and a promise of rain. The sound of clashing swords, the rhythm of their movements was the only thing Jack could focus on. Meanwhile, just beyond the canyon's rocky outcrop, Clara and Eli were engaged in their own battle. Clara, ever resourceful, had quickly climbed to higher ground, using the terrain to her advantage. Her rifle was steady in her hands as she aimed at one of McAllister's men, her finger pulling the trigger with a steady resolve. The shot rang out, sending one of the henchmen tumbling to the ground. But there was still more to deal with. Eli, his face grim but determined, ducked behind a boulder, pulling his revolver with practiced ease. He fired at another man, the bullet catching him off guard and sending him reeling. The wildness of the fight didn't faze Eli. He had lived through too many skirmishes to be rattled. But Clara? Clara was different. She was unshaken, but her resolve was matched only by the deep concern in her eyes as she scanned the battlefield for Jack. She had to trust him, trust that he could handle McAllister. But that didn't mean she was willing to leave him to face danger alone. With a swift motion, Clara dropped down from her perch, rushing toward Eli. They moved together, covering each other as they exchanged fire with McAllister's remaining men. Their teamwork was seamless, a quiet testament to the bond that had formed between them over the past weeks. Clara was no stranger to danger, but her heart beat faster every time she caught sight of Jack, still locked in his fierce duel. Back in the canyon, Jack's legs were starting to feel the burn, his chest tightening with the effort it took to keep McAllister's sword at bay. His body was tired, each parry growing harder as the minutes dragged on, but his mind was clear, sharper than it had ever been. Jack's thoughts flashed briefly to Clara. Her quiet strength, her courage in the face of everything that had come their way was the fire that kept him going. He couldn't falter now, not when he had her by his side. Not when he had a future to protect. McAllister's blade swung again, this time catching Jack's side with a glancing blow. The pain was immediate, a sharp, searing reminder of just how dangerous this man truly was. But Jack didn't flinch. He wouldn't give McAllister the satisfaction. He was too close to victory to let anything, especially his own pain, stop him. "Is that the best you've got, Callahan?" McAllister sneered, pressing his advantage. But in that moment, Jack's resolve only hardened. The strike had brought back memories of the past, of a time when he had been a different man, a man who fought for all the wrong reasons. But now, in this moment, he was fighting for something more. He was fighting for Clara, for everything that was right in the world. With a low growl, Jack pushed himself forward, launching a counterattack that sent McAllister stumbling back, his sword faltering in Jack's firm grip. "I'm not the man I was, McAllister," Jack growled, "and you won't break me now." McAllister's sneer faltered for a split second, and Jack took advantage of the moment. With a swift motion, he disarmed McAllister, sending the man's sword flying through the air. McAllister stumbled backward, fear flickering across his face for the first time. Before McAllister could regain his footing, Jack stepped forward, his hand gripping the man's collar, pulling him into an unrelenting gaze. "This ends here." As McAllister struggled against his grip, Jack's resolve solidified. Clara was safe, the land was safe, and McAllister's greed would no longer have a hold on them. In the distance, Eli and Clara had successfully fended off the remaining henchmen, and as the last of them fell, the wind seemed to shift, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves and the promise of a storm. Jack turned his gaze toward Clara, his chest still heaving from the battle, but his heart light with victory. Clara caught his eye from across the battlefield, her face a mixture of relief and triumph. Their shared gaze spoke volumes of trust, of love, and of a future that now seemed within reach. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. Together they had faced the storm, and together they would build something that no man, no force could take away from them. Chapter 7. The Fall of the Villain. The canyon, once the stage for the fiercest of battles, lay still in the aftermath of the storm. Jack Callahan stood tall, his breath heavy but steady, the weight of the fight slowly ebbing from his shoulders. In front of him, McAllister staggered back, his sword clanging to the ground with a hollow sound, as Jack disarmed him with one final, resolute swing. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and gunpowder, but in the quiet that followed, the canyon seemed to hold its breath. The chaos of the duel faded into nothing more than a distant memory, and the only sound left was the ragged breathing of the defeated and the victorious alike. McAllister, eyes wide with disbelief, took a step back, his face pale, his hands trembling as they hovered near the empty space where his weapon had fallen. "You think this is over?" he spat, voice strained with rage and fear. "You think you've won?" Jack's gaze never wavered from the man before him. The wildness in McAllister's eyes, the greed, the treachery that had driven him. Jack had seen it all before, but now it was nothing but a hollow shell, the final remnants of a man who had sought to tear apart everything Jack held dear. "It's over, McAllister," Jack said, his voice steady, full of the quiet confidence that only a man who had fought for everything he had could possess. "Your plans have crumbled, your men have turned on you." McAllister's gaze darted to the men behind him, his henchmen, the ones who had been a part of his scheme. But it wasn't just Jack and his men who had fought back. One by one, McAllister's own men had seen through his lies, the promises of wealth and power unraveling in the face of the truth. They had turned on him, just as surely as the desert sun had begun to set on this treacherous day. There was no more fight left in McAllister. He knew it, and so did Jack. The realization that his world was crumbling around him settled over McAllister like a blanket of cold. And in that moment, Jack saw it, the collapse of a man who had once held so much power, now reduced to nothing more than a shadow of his former self. "I didn't want it to come to this," Jack said, his voice tinged with regret, though his resolve remained firm. "But you forced my hand." McAllister opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips. The fight had gone out of him. There was no more bravado, no more arrogance. The man who had once plotted to take everything from them now stood alone, facing the consequences of his own treachery. As Jack stepped closer, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. The once violent struggle now gave way to a stillness that felt as final as the setting sun, its rays casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Behind Jack, Clara and Eli made their way over to him, their faces full of the same quiet victory. Clara's eyes met his, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. In that single, unspoken glance, Jack saw not only the end of the battle, but the beginning of something more. A future that was his to shape. A future that included Clara at his side. McAllister, broken and defeated, fell to his knees in the dust, his head hanging low in surrender. It was a silent admission of defeat. The moment when his empire of lies crumbled. Jack didn't speak. Didn't need to. The man had made his choices, and now he would face the consequences. The canyon was silent once more, save for the rustling of the dry brush and the distant calls of birds. The wind had died down, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting the landscape in a breathtaking hue of gold and red. The last of McAllister's men stood back, unsure of what to do now that their leader was no more. The greed and violence that had bound them together had shattered, leaving only the emptiness of defeat. Jack's eyes never left McAllister, but his mind was already on the future. He had fought for this land, for Clara, for everything that mattered, and now, with McAllister's defeat, they could finally breathe easy. The ranch was safe, Clara was safe, and the land, his land, was free. Clara stepped forward, her expression soft yet filled with quiet strength. She placed a hand on Jack's arm, her touch a gentle reassurance in the midst of the fading tension. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. Jack looked down at her, the weight of the day lifting from his shoulders as he took in the sight of her, the woman who had fought beside him, who had believed in him even when he hadn't fully believed in himself. He could feel the warmth of her presence, the promise of a future he'd never dared to dream of. "It is," he agreed, his voice low, filled with the satisfaction of victory, but also with a tenderness that was new and precious. "And it's because of you." Clara's eyes softened, and she smiled up at him, a smile full of the quiet joy of a battle well fought and a future worth fighting for. She reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek, and in that moment, Jack felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. As the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert before them stretched out, vast and untamed. It was a place of wild beauty, a place where the storms came and went, but where the land always endured. And now, for the first time in a long time, Jack felt certain that he and Clara would endure as well, together. The wind shifted, the last breath of the day carrying with it the promise of a new dawn. A dawn without McAllister's shadow hanging over them, a dawn where Jack and Clara could finally embrace the life they had fought for. And as the stars began to twinkle above, Jack knew that whatever lay ahead, he wouldn't face it alone. The desert was still. After the chaos of the previous day, the land felt like it had taken a deep breath, exhaling the remnants of the storm and the battle that had raged across it. Jack stood at the edge of the canyon, the early morning light casting a soft glow across the jagged rocks and the scattered remnants of what had been the final confrontation. The air was cool against his skin, the bruises from the fight aching, but nothing felt as heavy as it had in the days before. There was a sense of peace settling in, a calm that spoke of renewal. Clara stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise, its first rays painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. She had always been strong, but today there was something in the way she held herself. Something soft and tender, as if the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders. Eli joined them, his usual lightheartedness tempered by the gravity of the moment. He tipped his hat back, scratching at his stubbled chin as he surveyed the land they had fought for. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice low. "Don't reckon I've seen a sunrise quite like this before. Can't say I've ever been more grateful to see the light of day." Jack gave a soft chuckle, though it was laced with the fatigue of the long night. "Can't say I've seen one like it either," he agreed, his voice rough. "But we've earned it, haven't we?" Clara's hand found his, her fingers slipping between his with an ease that felt as natural as breathing. She squeezed gently, her touch warm and steady. "We've earned more than just the sunrise, Jack," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "We've earned the future." Jack looked at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and tenderness. She had fought beside him, not just on the battlefield, but in every decision, every step they had taken together. There was a quiet strength in her that had always been there, but now, in the soft morning light, he could see it clearer than ever before. Eli, sensing the moment between them, tipped his hat with a teasing grin. "I reckon I'll give you two some time. Looks like you got something to talk about." His voice held a playful edge, but there was an unmistakable warmth to it, a shared understanding that things were different now, that they had all made it through together. Jack turned to Eli, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Thanks, Eli. We'll catch up later." Eli tipped his hat again, turning toward the town. "I'll see what I can do about gathering the folks for a little celebration. Seems like we could all use a reason to smile." With that, Eli disappeared down the dusty path toward the town, leaving Jack and Clara alone with their thoughts. The weight of the past few days, of all the danger, the fear, the uncertainty, seemed to dissolve in the warmth of the sun. But it wasn't just the sun that made Jack feel lighter. It was Clara, standing beside him, her hand in his, her presence a steady reminder that no matter what the world threw at them, they were stronger for having faced it together. Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with something soft and knowing. "What happens now, Jack?" He thought for a moment, then turned to her with a smile. "Now we rebuild. Now we have the chance to make this land, our home, the way it was always meant to be." She smiled back, her eyes sparkling with the same quiet determination that had carried them through the darkest hours. "And you and me?" Jack's heart swelled. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "You and me, Clara, we've got all the time in the world." Later that afternoon, the town square, usually quiet and reserved, was alive with the sounds of celebration. The festive music of fiddles and banjos filled the air, accompanied by the rhythmic stomp of boots on the dirt. Laughter echoed from every corner, the joy of the people contagious as they gathered to honor the victory that had freed them from McAllister's grip. The fear that had once held them in its tight, suffocating grasp had melted away like the first light of dawn, replaced by an infectious energy that spread through the crowd. Jack and Clara stood at the edge of the festivities, their hands still clasped together, watching the people dance and laugh in the brightening evening. Clara's face was flushed with happiness, her eyes alight with the joy of the moment. Jack's heart stirred at the sight of her, so full of life, so full of promise. "It feels like a dream," she said, her voice light and full of wonder. Jack squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with love. "It's not a dream, Clara. This is real. We've made it through the worst of it." They stood there for a moment, lost in the beauty of the evening, the sound of the music, the sight of children running through the crowd, and the warmth of the setting sun on their skin. But then, with a wink and a teasing smile, Jack leaned closer. "Care for a dance?" Clara laughed, her eyes sparkling with playful mischief. "I'm not sure I've got the moves to keep up with you, cowboy." Jack raised an eyebrow, his smile full of challenge. "Oh, I reckon I can teach you a step or two. What do you say?" Clara stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on his chest as she met his gaze. "All right, but I warn you, I'm a quick learner." And with that, Jack pulled her gently into the rhythm of the music. As they moved together, the world around them seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of them, partners in every sense of the word. The joy in Clara's laughter, the warmth in her eyes, made Jack feel like the luckiest man alive. As they spun under the setting sun, Jack thought about everything they had overcome, the struggles, the fears, the battles, and in the midst of it all, he realized something that he had always known, but never fully understood until now. Love was the greatest victory of all. The celebration continued around them, but for Jack and Clara, the only thing that mattered was this moment. The promise of a future together, of a life built not on fear, but on hope and the unshakable bond they shared. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow across the town, Jack held Clara close, his heart full. This was their new beginning, a beginning they would share, side by side, no matter what the future held. And in that moment, under the warm light of the setting sun, Jack knew that redemption had already come. It had come not in the form of land or power, but in the quiet, unspoken promise of a love that could never be torn apart. The town square was alive with color, music, and laughter. The once quiet, somber streets were now filled with a joy that seemed to spill out from every corner. The fiddles and banjos played in sync, the notes light and merry, as the townsfolk dressed in their finest for the occasion danced beneath the twinkling lights strung between the buildings. The scent of roasted meats and fresh-baked pies filled the air, blending with the sound of children's laughter and the clinking of mugs. It was a celebration of life and justice, of a community united by resilience and the promise of something better. Jack stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of those he had fought alongside. His chest swelled with pride as he watched the town come together, the weight of their recent struggles now a distant memory. No more whispers of fear or betrayal, only the steady rhythm of people rebuilding their lives, step by step, song by song. Clara stood beside him, her hand slipping into his as she looked out at the gathering. Her gaze was soft, but there was a quiet strength in it, the kind that only comes from having faced down the darkest of days and come through stronger on the other side. "You've done it," she said, her voice light but filled with meaning. "We've done it." Jack turned to her, the warmth of her hand in his grounding him as he took in the sight of her, the woman who had stood by him, who had never wavered in her faith. "No, Clara, we've done it. Together." His voice softened, and he couldn't help but pull her closer. "You and me, we've built something worth fighting for. And now we get to enjoy it." A smile tugged at Clara's lips, and her eyes softened as she looked up at him. "And what are we going to do with it all, Jack? This life we've built?" He chuckled, the sound low and warm as he leaned in closer. "Well, I reckon we'll live it. Together. We'll see where the road takes us. But I'm not afraid of it anymore. Not with you by my side." She squeezed his hand, the connection between them solid, unspoken, but undeniable. "No more fear," she said, her voice steady. "Just us, and whatever comes next." Jack met her gaze, his heart swelling with the love and certainty he had once only dreamed of. The fight was over, but the journey was just beginning, and with Clara beside him, he knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but it would also be full of love. Love that would grow, deepen, and carry them both forward. As the music swelled around them, Jack pulled Clara into his arms, spinning her gently in the dance. The crowd parted around them, but it was as if they were in their own world, just the two of them, moving together in perfect harmony, the rhythm of the dance matching the steady beat of their hearts. The lights above them seemed to shimmer as they moved, casting soft shadows on the ground, and Jack couldn't help but marvel at the woman in his arms. The woman who had fought beside him. The woman who had shown him what love truly meant. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice low only for her to hear. Clara's cheeks flushed with the compliment, her eyes bright with a mixture of happiness and something deeper. "Not as beautiful as the life we're building," she teased, her tone light but her words holding more weight than she could have known. Jack's chest tightened at the thought. This wasn't just a new beginning for him and Clara. It was a new beginning for the entire town, for everyone who had believed in the promise of this place, who had fought to make it a home. And in that moment, Jack knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The dance slowed, and they came to a gentle stop, the music continuing to play in the background. Clara's hand rested on his chest, and Jack could feel the steady rhythm of her heart beneath his fingertips. "Jack," Clara said softly, looking up at him. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. This, you and me, it's right. It's where I'm meant to be." Jack cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing the soft skin there as he gazed down at her. The world around them seemed to quiet, and all that was left was the two of them. "I know, Clara. I know. And I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you know it too." Before she could respond, Eli's voice rang out from behind them, a grin in his voice. "Well, well, don't you two make a fine picture," Jack chuckled, pulling Clara a little closer as Eli approached. "You make a good point, Eli. This town's never seen a better couple." Eli winked, tipping his hat. "That's what I like to hear. But enough of all this sappy stuff. We've got a celebration to finish, don't we?" Clara laughed, her eyes sparkling with joy. "You're right, Eli." There's still plenty of life to be lived, and it's all ahead of us. With that, they joined the others in the town square, laughter, music, and dancing filling the air around them. The evening continued with joyous celebration, but as Jack and Clara danced again, surrounded by friends, family, and allies, they shared a quiet moment between the lively chaos, a moment just for them, where the promise of a future built on love and hope was enough to keep them both grounded. As the sun sank lower, its final rays stretching across the horizon, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. The battles, the struggles, the fear, it was all behind them now. And ahead, there was nothing but the wide open frontier, a land full of possibilities, waiting for them to make their mark. Together, they would face it. Together, they would build something strong, something lasting, a love that would carry them through the seasons of life. And as the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Jack pulled Clara close, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. There, under the vastness of the desert sky, he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning of their story.